Maybe we can say hi to everybody that's online. Can we say hi, everybody online on 3? 1, 2, 3. Hi, everybody online. I'm trying to think of ways to sort of connect the two groups. Anyway. So, as I said, I want to talk about bias. And according to Wikipedia, I looked at a bunch of different definitions, but I thought this one was the best one. Bias is disproportionate weight in favor or against an idea or thing, usually, and I want to emphasize the usually, in a way that is close-minded, prejudicial, or unfair. Biases can be innate or learned. People may develop biases for or against an individual, a group, or a belief. Now, culturally, we're talking a lot about bias lately. We're very politically polarized as a society. We're talking a lot about race things. It's there. It's really there in the forefront right now, and that can be a really tough conversation. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that we've actually fairly recently gone through a shift in the belief of whether bias is avoidable or not. Who thinks we can avoid our biases with enough discipline? Elizabeth's going, oh, maybe. You can work on it. That's key. Can you avoid it entirely, though? Probably not. If you go back even just about a century, we did think that it was avoidable. It came from a way of thinking called modernism and reductionism. But the idea was that if we were disciplined enough and put in the work, we could drill down and avoid bias. Now, by the time I went through school, we were taught that only old white men were privileged enough to see the world that way. So instead, we were taught to assume that we had a bias and identify it rather than avoid it. And I talked about this a lot before, but depending where you are, it's quite common to say, okay, I am a white man in a position of authority, living in such and such a place, this is me. So therefore, this is what I'm coming to this topic with. And I know, that's a controversial thing to do, but that's sort of a way of fighting it, right? So we're taught to identify it. But I think there's two other factors in this conversation as well. And the first are the cultural implications, emphasis on cultural, of the 2008 financial crisis. Everyone was affected differently, but it initiated a culture of reassessing our hopes and dreams. Who here has watched tiny house shows on TV or seen them? Nobody? Mary has. I know, at least who here has heard of tiny houses? A few of you. You guys need to watch more television. What about homesteading? Have you heard about homesteading? I mean, that's an old concept, but it's coming back in a big way. If you go online, there's a lot of people homesteading right now. What about minimalism or decluttering? Who's heard of Marie Kondo? Right? I can tell the people that watch television. All this stuff, and and then the trade of stuff. A lot of people are trading having things for experiences. And all of these are movements that sprung out of overeducated and underemployed people losing faith in the economy and government. There's this post-war dream that everybody could have a car and a detached house that we've been promised for generations, and a lot of people got it. And then in 2008, it didn't seem possible anymore. Even if it turns out to be possible, a lot of people are now asking whether we even want it, whether that is a good dream or not. The second factor is the internet. We suddenly have access to every piece of information known to man on a screen in our pocket. I mean, think about that. We're recording the service right now on what 30 years ago would have been a calculator, right? Also, anybody can find their tribe, and this is the key, I think. Whereas before, if you were an outlier, you had to bear that burden yourself. Now anyone can find other people like them online. And generally, I think this is a really, really good thing. But not always. So we have the sum of the world's knowledge available to anyone with the motivation to look for it, and a supportive community for anyone to share it. If you can think about it, that community exists online. Here's another key. Additionally, not everyone's dreams were shattered. If you had a secure job and your house was mostly paid off, then the 2008 financial crisis probably wasn't so bad. Many are still living that dream because they haven't had it challenged. And they're unsure of why others are straying from it. Some people are unwilling to reevaluate that dream, but are also upset that they can't seem to attain it. So there's a whole group of people that are feeling hard done by for not getting what their parents got. And that group in particular has found each other on the internet. So the picture I'm trying to paint is this tangled ball of changing hopes, desires, habits, reactions, wounds, and whatever else forms our biases in a world where it's really easy to find an echo chamber. We've all heard that term, echo chamber. We can find people that agree with us no matter where we go. A picture of a world where it's so easy to have that bias and really hard to untangle it without being intentional about it. Now, Jonah does not have the bias that I'm talking about. To be quite frank, Jonah is a racist. Jonah was an obvious racist at that time when xenophobia, or fear of other races, was not only the norm, but it was encouraged. There was a lot of divides between nations in those days, and Jonah stood out as being particularly upset about other races. And the fact that he stood out as a racist to even the original audience of this book tells us something. Just to recap, God asks Jonah to go prophesy to the people of Nineveh so that they repent from their evil ways. But Jonah hates Nineveh and Ninevites and wants God to turn them into a smoking crater. That's what he's hoping. He's hoping there's undertones of Sodom and Gomorrah here, and that's what he wants. So instead of doing what God asks him to do, he hops on a boat and sails to the end of the known world. We're pretty sure he was going to Spain. So that's about as far as they would have known. It would have been like going to the moon. In an effort to withhold God's love and grace from people that he hates. That's pretty strong. That's a pretty strong reaction. Now, God is in control and brings Jonah back using a storm and a giant fish who eats him and then vomits him up alive on the beach, presumably back closer to Nineveh. And yes, vomits is the right term. If you look at the original Hebrew, it's meant to be that kind of vision. Like I said, there's supposed to be sort of this over-the-top, almost humor in Jonah. So Jonah finally does as he's told. He thinks, all right, I'm powerless, so he goes and does it. And Nineveh repents en masse. 120,000 people. Nineveh was not known as a good place. And the people of Nineveh repent en masse and become particularly dedicated to Yahweh, though they don't really know what they're doing. It's kind of funny to see what they do. Jonah is so mad that he goes and he sits in the hot desert sun on a hill near town until he grows faint. He's making decisions that are going to make him even angrier at this point. And then God causes a plant to grow over him, a shade plant, and there's this whole discussion that we read this morning. But the book of Jonah isn't a simple warning about racism. It is a tool for rabbis to help their communities. And specifically help them examine their own biases. Remember I said Jonah doesn't really have the type of bias that we're talking about, but the communities that were reading Jonah would have. Israel was the people God had chosen through which to reach the rest of God's people, i.e., the rest of the world. But when you are God's chosen people, it's far too easy to just stop there. And Israel often did. Jonah was an easy negative role model that everybody could see. You could point at Jonah and then examine the more subtle ways that you might be similar. That's sort of what this story was for. Now, my goal today is to talk about bias more broadly than race, because there's bias about everything. We might be biased towards red cars instead of white cars. I don't know. There's biases about everything. And they can be significant, they can be minor. We have our preferences, right? But I do want to use race to just illustrate something. So when George Floyd was killed back in I forget whether it's the spring or summer now, I thought it was very important that we talk about it. But I had no idea how to do that. And honestly, I still have no idea. The reason is that I am a white man in a leadership position. My job right now when we're talking about race is to be quiet and listen. I mean, I also recognize I'm supposed to be up here in the pulpit saying things, but that's a really hard position to be in when it comes to race in 2020. Also, how do you address race in a place that is overwhelmingly white as Hastings County? Because race here is an abstract conversation. We know that we have racial biases, but in large part, all we can do is talk about it. We don't get a lot of opportunity to practice. And the handful of minority people here probably just want to go about their day. When you live off the beaten path like we do, you have to be more intentional about examining your biases, because we all sort of have our own little kingdoms. That's often why we live in the country. We can go home and close the door. It's easier to ignore. We live in a quiet, laid-back culture. One of my favorite poems is A Country North of Belleville by Al Purdy. I think I've even read it here before. And he says we're a little adjacent to where the world is. And I think that's a really good way of putting it. The problems of 40,000 rural people are not national news. And national news and the problems of the world feel like they're down the road 2 hours, whether you're going to Ottawa or Toronto. We're connected, but we don't have to be, right? We can sort of compartmentalize a little more easily. We can engage if we get into the car, but we don't have to. There's a step in between. We have to be especially intentional about examining our biases. So Jonah is a fun story, and it's meant to be a fun story. But I think simply reminds us to spend some time taking stock of our biases. It's kind of like asking what you're not thinking about. It's a tough exercise, but it's an exercise that keeps us limber and ready to engage with God when God calls. I don't think we can get rid of our biases. I think they're just there. They're sort of the reactive part of us. But if we know them, then we can be ready to work around them when God calls.